You were standing 12 feet away from the man who was going to kill you, and you had absolutely no idea. He was eating dinner with your commanding general, laughing, pouring wine, a decorated Roman officer, a citizen of the empire, a man who had bled alongside Roman soldiers in Illyricum and earned every honor Rome knew how to give. You had probably seen him ride past 100 times. You may have saluted him. His name was Arminius, and in approximately 14 hours, he was going to lead tens of thousands of Germanic warriors out of the trees and systematically destroy every single man in your column. You couldn't have known. That's the point. Everything Rome had built, its system of alliances, its military training, its method of turning enemies into officers, had been working perfectly for decades. It had just produced the one man capable of ending you, and tomorrow morning you were going to march straight toward him. You could not have survived trusting Arminius because you never had a choice about whether to trust him. He was not assigned to your column as an unknown quantity, a foreign auxiliary commander you might have quietly watched with suspicion from a distance. He was Varus's most trusted local advisor. He attended the general's dinners. He rode beside the command staff. He had Roman citizenship, equestrian rank, and a service record that included the Great Illyrian Revolt, one of the hardest campaigns Rome had fought in a generation. In the hierarchy of credibility that governed your world, Arminius sat near the top. Your general trusted him. That meant you trusted him. That was how the Roman military worked. And that was exactly the vulnerability Arminius had spent years positioning himself to exploit. To understand how he got there, you need to understand what Rome did to him before he ever set foot in your camp. He was born around 18 BC, the son of Segimirus, a chieftain of the Cherushi tribe occupying the territory east of the Rhine that Rome was methodically trying to absorb. The Cherushi were powerful enough that Rome needed them cooperative, and the price of that cooperation was children. Rome's standard method for managing tribal leadership was to take their sons as hostages, not in chains, not in punishment, but in comfort and education. The deliberate, systematic process of turning the next generation of tribal leadership into Romans. You were removed young enough that Latin became natural, Roman customs became familiar, and the empire's way of organizing the world began to feel like the only logical way to organize it. Arminius arrived in Rome as a boy and was educated accordingly. He learned Latin. He absorbed Roman military doctrine, the formations, the logistics chains, the command hierarchies, the engineering principles behind road building and fortification. He did not study these things from the outside. He studied them as a participant, as someone being actively trained to execute them. There is a difference between knowing how a machine works and knowing how to operate it. Rome made sure Arminius knew both, and then Rome sent him to war. His service in the Great Illyrian Revolt of 6 to 9 AD was not ceremonial. That insurgency was one of the most brutal Rome had faced in decades, like the 3 years of grinding combat across difficult terrain against tribes that refused to fight on Roman terms, using ambush and terrain and attrition to neutralize advantages that should have been overwhelming. Arminius was there. He watched how a numerically inferior force could dismantle Roman tactical superiority by refusing to engage on Roman ground. He did not just survive that education. He performed well enough that Rome rewarded him with citizenship and equestrian rank, the second tier of Roman aristocracy, the class that produced officers and administrators, and the middle layer of imperial governance. Equestrian rank meant he commanded auxiliary cavalry. Rome gave him troops because it made operational sense, but because a man who understood both the Roman system and the tribal cultures from which auxiliary soldiers were drawn was exactly what a provincial command needed. What it also meant was that Arminius understood, from direct personal experience, exactly how auxiliary units were deployed, how they communicated with the legions, where the seams in the command structure were, and precisely how those seams could be forced open under pressure. Now look at the man commanding your column and understand the contrast. Publius Quinctilius Varus was competent in the environments for which he had been trained. He had administered Africa. He had governed Syria. Modern historians consistently describe him as a capable administrator and an inadequate soldier. He understood Roman law, Roman taxation, Roman bureaucratic procedure. You see, he understood how to turn functioning societies into functioning provinces. He did not understand war the way a man who had actually fought one understands it. He was sent to Germania to provincialize it, to apply the same administrative tools that had worked in Africa and Syria to a tribal territory that was not remotely similar to either. He was the wrong man for the job. And when Arminius returned from Rome to his people east of the Rhine, he had studied Verus carefully enough to know exactly how to appear indispensable to him. When Arminius came back, he did not return as a nostalgic tribesman relieved to be home. He returned as something Rome had never intended to create, a man who had spent years inside the most powerful military machine in the world, who understood its strengths well enough to respect them and its weaknesses well enough to dismantle them. He came back with Roman tactical doctrine, Roman engineering knowledge, and a first-hand understanding of exactly how a column of 20,000 men moves, camps, communicates, and collapses. You were one of those 20,000 men, and the person Rome had trained to understand you better than you understood yourself was already back in the forest, waiting. You could not have survived the march into the forest because the warning that could have saved you was delivered, heard, and thrown away before you packed your first piece of equipment. His name was Segestes. He was Arminius's own father-in-law, a Cherushi nobleman of significant standing, pro-Roman by genuine conviction rather than tactical calculation, and a man with direct personal access to Verus at the highest level of the camp's social hierarchy. He was not a rumor. He was not an anonymous informant passing whispers through intermediaries. He sat across from your commanding general and told him explicitly, directly, and in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, that Arminius was planning to ambush the column. He named the conspiracy. He identified the conspirator. He asked Verus to arrest Arminius and the other ringleaders immediately before the march began, while there was still time to stop what was coming. Verus listened, considered, and decided that Segestes was wrong. He then had Segestes removed from his presence, invited Arminius to dinner, and began finalizing the march order. You were not told any of this. You were a soldier in the ranks, and soldiers in the ranks were told what they needed to know to march and fight. What you needed to know, apparently, was the direction of travel and the weight of your pack. What you did not need to know was that your general had just dismissed the only man who could have prevented the next 3 days from happening. Velleius Paterculus, a Roman historian who served in Germania during this period and had direct contact with officers present at these events, recorded what followed the dismissal of Segestes with a precision that carries the specific weight of proximity. Arminius sat beside Verus at dinner on the night before the fatal march. He ate. He drank. He performed the easy familiarity of a trusted officer at the end of a long campaigning season, relaxed, conversational, completely at ease in the general's company. Whatever he was thinking, whatever he knew was already set in motion in the forest ahead, none of it reached his face. Verus saw his most reliable local commander. He saw the man who had made the summer's administrative work easier, who had helped mediate tribal disputes, who had ridden beside the column on dozens of routine patrols without incident. He saw exactly what Arminius needed him to see. Understanding why Verus made this choice matters, because it was not stupidity. It was the logical application of every framework Rome had given him for evaluating trustworthiness. Arminius spoke Latin without an accent. He understood Roman social conventions well enough to navigate an officer's dinner without a single false step. He had fought under Roman eagles in Illyricum and been decorated for it. He held citizenship and equestrian rank, these two markers that carried enormous weight in the Roman system of social credibility. On one side of the scale sat all of that, years of demonstrated loyalty, visible Roman identity, institutional validation. On the other side sat an accusation from a feuding father-in-law with obvious personal grievances against the accused. Verus weighed them using the tools Rome had given him. The tools were wrong for this situation, and you were going to pay for that mismatch with your life. What Verus did not know, or chose not to investigate, was the operational structure Arminius had been quietly assembling throughout the entire summer. While accompanying the column on routine duties, while attending administrative proceedings, while maintaining the appearance of a cooperative auxiliary commander going about normal business. Arminius had been using the unique access his dual role provided to build something. He contacted tribes with long-standing grievances against Roman taxation and Roman authority. He coordinated timing across groups that had never before operated in concert. He selected terrain. He planned approach routes. He arranged for the construction of fortifications in the forest that the column would not discover until it was too late to matter. He did all of this while filing Roman administrative reports and sharing Roman officers' meals. The fabricated revolt was the mechanism that set everything into motion. Reports had been reaching Verus that Roman detachments patrolling the supposedly pacified territory were being attacked by the Angrivari and other tribes in the region. These incidents appeared spontaneous and localized, were exactly the kind of low-level resistance that any provincial administration expected during pacification, and exactly the kind of situation that required a response. When a larger revolt was reported, adjusting the column's march to address it was not recklessness. It was standard procedure. Arminius had studied that procedure long enough to build a false emergency that fit it perfectly. As the column prepared to move, Arminius rode up to Verus, calm and purposeful, and explained that he needed to ride ahead to consolidate the scattered auxiliary forces before they could be useful. Verus nodded. Arminius rode away into the trees. You watched him go and thought nothing of it. By the time you understood why he had left, there was forest in every direction and no road back to anywhere safe. See, you could not have survived the forest because the forest was not a location. It was a machine, designed, prepared, and calibrated over months specifically to take everything Rome had trained you to do and make it not just ineffective, but actively fatal. Every advantage you carried into those trees, your formation discipline, your interlocking shield wall, your ability to respond to centralized commands across a large body of men, had been studied by the man who built this place. He knew exactly what those advantages required to function. He had spent years executing them himself, and he had chosen this ground precisely because it offered none of the conditions they needed. You marched in on the morning of the second day of the column's movement, and the forest closed around the column almost immediately. The paths were narrow, was far narrower than anything a force your size was designed to move through efficiently. The trees pressed in from both sides, limiting visibility to a few dozen feet in any direction. The column that had assembled on open ground as a coherent, organized fighting force began stretching the moment it entered the tree line, compressing at obstacles, gapping between units, the tight organizational structure that made Roman infantry so lethal in open battle, slowly pulling apart like cloth caught on something in the dark. Your column was not just soldiers. It carried the full logistical weight of a Roman army in the field. Baggage wagons, pack animals, civilians, traitors, servants, the families of officers who had been following Roman columns across the empire for generations, because that was simply what happened on campaign, was all of it behind you, slowing the rear, tightening the gaps between contingents, turning what should have been a marching column into something closer to a procession that stretched for miles along paths that could barely accommodate two men walking abreast. Roman military doctrine was built on the assumption of space. You had none. The earthen ramparts were already there. You did not know that yet, but Arminius had pre-constructed camouflaged walls of packed earth along the ridgelines above the path you were walking. Archaeologists excavating at Calcres in 1987 confirmed their presence and location, establishing the precise geometry of what had been prepared for you. These were not battlefield fortifications assembled in the hours before contact. They required planning, surveying, labor, an exact foreknowledge of where a column of your size would be forced to move. They channeled your path. They created elevated positions from which warriors could strike down into a formation that had no room to respond, no space to wheel, no ground on which to form the structures that Roman soldiers spent their entire careers training to build and hold. Then, in the late morning, without warning, it started. Stones first, coming from the tree line to your left, from the ridge line above you, from positions you could hear but not locate. Then arrows, then the frama, the Germanic throwing spear, short and dense and designed for exactly this range, this terrain, this kind of fight. They came from every direction simultaneously, and the men around you began to fall before anyone had identified a single target to respond to. The Bructeri warriors who launched this first wave did not charge. They did not commit to a sustained engagement that your training had prepared you to meet and break. They struck, inflicted casualties, and dissolved back into the forest before the legionaries could mount any coherent response. Then silence, then strikes from somewhere else entirely. You cannot charge an enemy you cannot see. You cannot hold a formation against an attack that has no front. Every response available to you, every drill, every instinct built by years of Roman military training assumed an enemy willing to stand in a place long enough to be engaged. There was no such enemy. There was only the tree line and the sound of men dying around you and the complete absence of anything to fight back against. Then the rain came, heavy and continuous, the kind of autumn downpour that northern Germania produces without apology. Your scutum, the large rectangular shield that was the foundation of every defensive formation you knew, was constructed from laminated wood covered in leather. Dry, it was one of the finest pieces of military equipment in the ancient world. Soaked through, it doubled in weight and began to warp at the edges, the leather separating from the wood in ways that compromised its structural integrity. Your segmented plate armor began rusting at the joints with a speed that open-field campaigning had never produced. Your hobnailed sandals, built for Roman roads, were now pulling free of ankle-deep mud with each step in a way that turned every mile into an ordeal that left you exhausted before the fighting even resumed. The guides who had been leading the column disappeared with the first wave of attackers. You were now blind, bleeding, lost in hostile forest with failing equipment, in rain that showed no sign of stopping, with no reliable way to know where you were going or what was waiting there, and somewhere ahead, the ramparts were ready. You could not have survived the next 3 days because the next 3 days were not designed to be survived. Not by you, not by anyone in that column. What Arminius had constructed in the Teutoburg forest was not a battle in any sense your training had prepared you for. It was a process. A deliberate, patient, methodical process of removing every option available to you, one by one. Yes, in a sequence that had been planned months in advance by a man who had spent years learning exactly which options Romans reached for under pressure and exactly how to close them off before you got there. The War Council on the night of the first day made the only decision it could: continue west. There was no viable route back through terrain the column had already spent a day bleeding across, no way to recover the guides who had vanished with the first wave of attackers, and no intelligence about what lay in any direction except the one the path pointed. The baggage would be left behind. The seriously wounded would be left behind. The army would move faster and push through. These were rational decisions made by men who still believed that the core problem was navigational. That if they could reach open ground, the situation would become recoverable. They were wrong about what the core problem was. The core problem was that the man who had planned this had already accounted for exactly those decisions. You broke camp the next morning and found that the overnight rain had transformed the forest route into something that no longer resembled a path in any useful sense. The mud was deep enough that each step required a conscious physical effort to extract your foot before the next one could be placed. Fallen trees blocked the trail at intervals, forcing the column to slow, compress, gap, and stretch in patterns that progressively separated the three main contingents from each other across miles of woodland. See, the baggage you had abandoned the previous evening had taken your food reserves and medical supplies with it. You were moving faster in the technical sense, and more slowly in every practical one, burning energy you could not replace on terrain that was actively working against you. The attacks resumed immediately, and with greater intensity than the day before. The pattern was identical: strikes from the tree line, casualties inflicted, withdrawal before any response could be organized, then silence, then strikes from a completely different direction. But the intervals were shorter now, and the pressure was continuous enough that the column never regained the psychological footing it had lost on the first day. You cannot charge an enemy who retreats into trees before you can close the distance. You cannot hold a line against an attack that materializes from a new direction every time you orient toward the last one. You cannot maintain unit cohesion when the men ahead of you and behind you are separated by terrain and casualties, and the complete breakdown of the information flow that Roman command structure depended on to function. By midday, the column had effectively ceased to exist as a unified force. 3 isolated contingents were strung out across miles of trail with no reliable communication between them and no shared picture of what was happening anywhere outside their immediate position. Officers at the front did not know the situation at the rear. Officers at the rear were receiving no orders from the front. The organizational architecture that Rome had spent centuries refining, the system of hierarchy and rapid information flow that allowed tens of thousands of men to function as a single coordinated organism, had dissolved into the mud and the noise and the unrelenting pressure from every direction simultaneously. Verus ordered the cavalry north. Valla Numonius, the cavalry commander, took the Roman horse along a separate path toward Allied territory to the west. It was the last mobile asset the column possessed, the one element that retained the speed to potentially break the encirclement and bring relief. Germanic warriors carrying looted Roman equipment were waiting for them. The cavalry was destroyed. When that news reached Verus, he understood finally and completely what had been done to him. He fell on his own sword. His senior officers followed. Velius Paterculus, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius all confirm it. You were now in the forest without a commanding general, without cavalry, without supplies, without guides, without communication between your contingent and the others, and without any remaining option that did not require walking further into the kill zone Arminius had spent months constructing around you. 2 officers, Lucius Aegius and Caeonius, assumed command of what remained. On the final morning, Aegius moved west and found the earthen rampart waiting across the path, the pre-built fortification that confirmed in a single visual detail that none of this had ever been improvised. While his men were pinned trying to clear it, Arminius committed his full force against Caeonius from behind, then turned west and destroyed what remained of Aegius. The last thing many of your fellow soldiers saw was a wall that had been built specifically to be the last thing they saw. You could not have survived what came after the fighting stopped. And here is the thing about that sentence that you need to sit with for a moment. The fighting stopping was not the worst outcome. For a significant number of the men who made it through the 3 days in the Teutoburg forest, who were still breathing when the Germanic warriors moved through the wreckage to collect what the battle had left behind, the ending of the battle was not relief. It was not rescue. It was the beginning of something that in some cases lasted longer than the careers of the men who had marched into that forest as soldiers of the most powerful empire on earth. What happened to prisoners divided along lines of rank and perceived utility, and neither category produced an outcome you would have chosen given any alternative. Common soldiers became property, not in the theoretical, legally modulated sense that Roman law applied to slavery within the empire, with its frameworks for manumission, its property rights for enslaved people, its bureaucratic pathways toward eventual freedom. Germanic tribal captivity operated outside all of those frameworks entirely. You were a labor unit in an economy that had no institutional structure for processing Roman prisoners at scale, which meant that your treatment, your workload, your survival, and any possibility of your eventual release depended entirely on the individual judgment of whoever owned you. There was no appeals process. There was no census. There was no administrative machinery tracking your existence that might eventually produce a letter, an order, a rescue. You had been a Roman soldier. Now you were invisible. Officers received different treatment, and different in this context means worse in ways that Tacitus and Cassius Dio both recorded with the flat, careful precision of historians describing things they found genuinely disturbing. Those considered suitable for ritual purposes were sacrificed to the ancient Germanic gods in ceremonies conducted at forest altars and in sacred groves. These were not hasty killings dressed up in religious language. They were deliberate, structured, theologically significant acts performed by people who believed with complete sincerity that the gods who had delivered this victory required acknowledgement proportional to its scale. Those Roman officers who had administered provinces and commanded thousands of men ended their lives as offerings in forest clearings east of the Rhine, which was not a fate that any Roman military training had included in its preparation for what service might require you to endure. Others were killed by means that ancient sources describe without elaboration, which in the context of ancient historical writing is itself a form of emphasis. The site of the final battle, already covered in the dead from 3 days of fighting, became something that sources struggled to contain within normal descriptive language. When Germanicus led his retaliatory campaigns into the region in 15 AD, 6 years after the battle, his soldiers encountered the physical evidence still present in the forest. Tacitus records what they found with detail that carries the specific weight of eyewitness accounts. Bleached bones scattered across the ground, skulls nailed to the trunks of trees, the remains of altars, and occasionally a living Roman soldier, a man who had survived the battle and the years of captivity that followed it, too altered by what he had experienced to process his own rescue in any straightforward way. Verus did not survive to be captured. He had fallen on his sword during the battle, and his body was recovered afterward by the Germanic warriors. His head was removed and sent to Maroboduo, king of the Marcomanni, as a demonstration of what had been accomplished. Maroboduo forwarded it to Augustus. The emperor received it, arranged for its burial in the family tomb, and then went into months of mourning severe enough to disrupt the normal functioning of the imperial court. The men taken as slaves at Teutoburg remained in captivity for spans of time that reframed the entire event from a military defeat into something closer to a life sentence. Tacitus records that around 50 AD, 40 years after the battle, Roman forces under Publius Pomponius Secundus defeated a chatty raiding band in Germania Superior and freed a small number of survivors from Verus's legions who had been held in slavery the entire time. 40 years. A soldier of 20 in September of 9 AD would have been 60 years old before Roman arms finally reached him. You marched into that forest as a citizen soldier of Rome, with a rank and a unit and a legal identity that the empire had spent centuries developing the infrastructure to protect. You came out of it, if you came out at all, as something the empire had no category for. Not dead, not free, not forgotten exactly, but filed under a column in a ledger that no one was actively updating. Just gone. You could not have survived the Teutoburg forest, and neither could the world that sent you there. That is the part of this story that extends beyond your death, beyond the deaths of the 20,000 men who marched into those trees with you, beyond the grief of the families who received no bodies and no official notification, because there was no administrative machinery capable of processing a loss at that scale. What died in the Teutoburg forest in September of 9 AD was not just 3 legions. It was a strategic vision for what Europe was going to become. And the consequences of that vision dying played out across the next 4 centuries in ways that reshaped the physical map of the Western world so completely that you can trace their outline on a modern atlas right now. Augustus lost somewhere between 15 and 20,000 soldiers in 3 days. Rome's total legionary establishment at the time numbered approximately 150,000 men, meaning that 3 days in a Germanic forest destroyed somewhere between 8 and 15% of the entire Roman army. That is not a setback that an empire absorbs and pushes through. That is a structural wound that changes the calculus of everything that follows. Augustus was in his 70s. He had spent his entire adult life managing the gap between Roman ambition and Roman capability, threading the needle between what the empire wanted to do and what it could actually sustain. He understood immediately, with the specific clarity of a man who had built his reign on that kind of calculation, what your deaths meant for every plan that had depended on the assumption that Germania east of the Rhine was conquerable. Suetonius records what followed with detail that reads like institutional trauma preserved in writing. Augustus let his hair and beard grow for months, the Roman equivalent of visible public collapse for a man of his status, and his obsessive attention to the image he projected. He moved through the palace at night. He struck his head against the walls. He repeated the same phrase until it became one of the most quoted sentences in Roman historical writing. Verus, give me back my legions. This was not performance. This was a man who understood that the soldiers he was mourning had not just died. They had taken something with them that could not be rebuilt by training new recruits or reorganizing existing formations. The legion numbers confirm it better than any written source. The 3 formations destroyed at Teutoburg, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never reconstituted. Every other legion number in Roman history was eventually reassigned, rebuilt, given new men and a new eagle, and sent back into the field. These 3 numbers were retired permanently. No Roman commander ever again led a 17th legion. The numbers sat empty in the military rolls for the remaining 4 centuries of the Western Empire's existence, a permanent institutional acknowledgement that what had happened to those formations was not a defeat to be processed and moved past, but a wound that the Roman military had collectively decided should remain visible. The strategic consequences were immediate and final. Augustus had spent decades building toward the Rhine-Elbe line as Rome's permanent northern frontier, a boundary that would have brought the territory of modern Germany, Denmark, and significant portions of Central Europe within the empire's administrative reach. That project ended in September of 9 AD. The Rhine became the border. Tiberius accepted it. Claudius accepted it. Trajan, who pushed deeper into Dacia and Mesopotamia than any emperor before him, accepted it. The Antonines accepted it. 4 centuries of emperors, including some of the most militarily aggressive rulers in the ancient world, looked at the Rhine and concluded that the territory beyond it had demonstrated clearly enough what it would cost. Germanicus tried. His campaigns of 14 to 16 AD recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards and inflicted genuine damage on the tribes that had participated in the ambush. The 3rd eagle was not recovered until 41 AD, under Claudius, more than 3 decades after the battle. Tiberius recalled Germanicus before any permanent territorial gains could be consolidated, having decided at the highest level of imperial authority that the Rhine line was where Roman Germany ended and where something else began. That something else was never Romanized. The Germanic peoples east of the Rhine never had their languages replaced by Latin. Their tribal structures were never dissolved into Roman provincial administration. Their legal traditions were never absorbed into Roman jurisprudence. The cultural patterns that survived Rome's decision not to advance became the foundation of the Germanic kingdoms of the early medieval period, which became the ancestors of the nations whose borders you can read on any modern map of Europe. You died in a forest in 9 AD. The world that built you, that trained you, that marched you into those trees, died there too. And everything that came after was built on the ground where you fell. You could not have survived Arminius, and neither, in the end, could he. That is the final dimension of this story, the one that sits underneath the military history and the strategic consequences and the permanent redrawing of the European map. The man who destroyed you did not walk away from what he had done into a long and celebrated life of Germanic independence. He walked into a different kind of trap, one that had nothing to do with Roman earthen ramparts or forest terrain or fabricated revolts, one that had been waiting for him in the structure of the world he had fought to protect from the moment the last Roman soldier fell in the Teutoburg forest. He had unified Germanic tribes that had spent generations competing with each other for cattle, territory, and status. He had done it through the specific authority of a man who had studied the most powerful military organization in the world from the inside, and then used that knowledge to make it flinch. That authority was real. The victory that produced it was real. And the moment the immediate Roman threat receded, both the authority and the victory became problems rather than assets, because the world Arminius had saved was structurally incapable of containing what saving it had made him. Germanic tribal society did not organize itself around centralized personal authority. Power was distributed, consensual in the specific and limited way of tribal councils, deeply and instinctively resistant to any individual whose influence began to look like the kind of singular dominance that the tribes associated correctly. With exactly the Roman system they had just spent years fighting to exclude from their territory. Arminius had spent his formative years becoming precisely the kind of man that system produced. The strategic vision, the hierarchical command, the capacity to subordinate competing tribal interests to a unified objective across multiple seasons of coordinated action. These were Roman qualities as much as Germanic ones, and the people who had benefited from them in the forest were now watching them consolidate in a single man and reaching the same conclusion that Germanic tribal politics always reached about that kind of consolidation. It made him dangerous. And dangerous men in that world did not survive long after they stopped being useful. Segestes never accepted what had happened. The feud that had begun with the warning to Varus, the accusation your general dismissed over dinner while Arminius sat beside him, continued with a sustained bitterness that was personal and political simultaneously. In 15 AD, during Germanicus's retaliatory campaigns, Segestes found his moment. He contacted Germanicus, declared for Rome, and surrendered Thusnelda, Arminius's wife, who was pregnant with Arminius's child at the time and had been living with her father after Segestes had taken her back from Arminius by force. Germanicus accepted the surrender. Thusnelda was taken to Roman-controlled territory. 2 years later, in 17 AD, she walked in chains through the streets of Rome in Germanicus's triumph, the formal ceremonial celebration of military victory. Tacitus records that she carried herself with a composure that distinguished her from everyone else in the procession. Her son, Thamelicus, was born in captivity and raised in Ravenna. Ancient sources lose track of him in childhood. The son of the man who destroyed 3 Roman legions disappears from the historical record before reaching adulthood, his ultimate fate unknown. Arminius learned what had happened and kept fighting. He fought Germanicus across 2 campaign seasons, never suffering a defeat decisive enough to finish him, never recovering the conditions that had made Teutoburg possible. Those conditions, the trusted position inside the Roman command structure, the months of undetected preparation, the perfect terrain engineered in advance, could not be reconstructed now that Rome was operating with its eyes open and its full anger engaged. He held. Rome eventually concluded the cost of continuing outweighed the benefit and recalled Germanicus. By every external measure, Arminius remained undefeated. Inside the Cherusci Confederation, the arithmetic was different and moving in one direction. His power had grown beyond what the tribal structure could process without treating it as a threat. The chieftains who had celebrated Teutoburg now watched the man who had made it happen, accumulating the kind of influence that looked, from where they stood, uncomfortably like the Roman domination they had just paid in blood to prevent. In 21 AD, 12 years after the Forest, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own Cherusci tribe. He was approximately 38 years old. Tacitus confirmed it and then wrote something extraordinary for a Roman historian describing the man who had destroyed 3 Roman legions. He called him the liberator of Germania. He noted that he had never been conquered by Rome. He recorded that Germanic tribes were still singing about him generations after his death. He was the most dangerous man Rome ever created. He used everything Rome taught him to break the empire's advance into northern Europe permanently, and then died at the hands of the people he had freed because the world he had saved had no place for the man it had taken to save it. Rome built him. He destroyed them, and then his own people finished what Rome could not. Go back to the moment before the march. You are standing in the Roman camp in early September of 9 AD, checking your equipment, adjusting the weight of your pack, doing what soldiers do before a column moves out. Nothing around you suggests that today is different from any other day of routine campaigning in a province that your commanding general has been successfully administering for 2 years. The man who is going to destroy your column rode away this morning to consolidate the auxiliary forces. You watched him go. You may have nodded. You had no reason to think anything of it. That is the point. You never had a reason. Everything that was going to kill you had been constructed specifically to look like something else. The warning had been delivered and dismissed before you broke camp. The revolt you are marching to suppress does not exist. The guides leading you into the forest are reporting back to the man who left this morning. The walls in the trees ahead were built months ago by someone who learned Roman military engineering from Roman military engineers. You could not have survived this because surviving it would have required you to see through a deception that had been designed by someone who understood Roman thinking from the inside, who knew which warnings Romans dismiss, which allies Romans trust, which procedures Romans follow automatically, and how to weaponize every single one of them simultaneously. Rome spent 20 years building the instrument of your destruction. It educated him, decorated him, promoted him, and placed him beside your commanding general at dinner the night before the march. You were never going to survive trusting Arminius. Rome made sure of that long before you ever picked up a sword. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Ready for more? Click here to watch the next video and keep the momentum going.